Today, we're going to dig into a book with one of the most direct and, let's be honest, provocative titles you're ever likely to see. It lays out a really fierce, uncompromising argument for gun rights in America. Now, our job here isn't to pick sides, not at all, but to map out exactly how the author builds his case. So, let's get right into it. Yep, you read that right. The title of the book is the thesis. Gun control is a crime, and those who enforce it are criminals. The author, Ken Pelock, basically lays all his cards on the table from page 1. And look, this isn't just some catchy slogan for a bumper sticker. He intends for it to be the foundation of a legal and philosophical argument that challenges, well, the entire basis of modern gun laws. All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. We'll follow his argument step by step. First, we'll unpack that core thesis. Then we'll see how he tries to take apart some of the most common counterarguments. After that, we'll get into the two foundational rights his whole case is built on, look at the historical events he uses for evidence, and finally, see how he tries to reframe the entire debate. So what is this core claim exactly? Well, he's not just saying that gun control is a bad idea. He's not even just saying it's unconstitutional. No, he takes it a huge step further. He argues that it's an active criminal offense, according to federal law that's already on the books. And he's not just pulling this out of thin air. He points to a specific statute. He cites Title 18, Section 241 of the U.S. Code. This law makes it a felony to conspire to injure, oppress, threaten, or intimidate any citizen in the free exercise of their constitutional rights. So, the way he sees it, gun control laws are a conspiracy to deprive people of their Second Amendment rights, which, in his view, makes the people who enforce those laws criminals. Okay, so after laying out his own core claim, the author switches gears. He goes on the offensive, really, trying to systematically deconstruct what he calls the deceptive arguments that you hear all the time in favor of gun control. Let's start with that phrase you hear constantly, common sense gun control. The author just flat out dismisses this as a meaningless political talking point. For him, it all comes down to a super strict, literal reading of the Second Amendment. He zeroes in on those 4 words, shall not be infringed, and argues that language leaves zero wiggle room. No exceptions, no regulations, period. Next up, he tackles that age-old debate, right? Is the Second Amendment for a militia or for individuals? And this is where he brings in the big guns, so to speak. The 2008 Supreme Court case, District of Columbia v. Heller. He points out that the court in Heller affirmed that the right to bear arms is an individual right, just like freedom of speech or any other right that the Constitution gives to the people. And what about so-called assault weapons? The author has a 2-part answer here. First, he argues the term itself is basically a political invention, used incorrectly for semi-automatic rifles. But his main point, the one that really gets to the core of his argument, is this. If the whole point of the Second Amendment is to be able to resist a tyrannical government, then citizens have to have access to the same kinds of weapons the government has. The Brady Bill gets its own special takedown in the book. He calls it a total fraud. He argues it's unconstitutional, that the stats are misleading. But his biggest concern, his deepest fear, is that it punishes people for something they might do in the future, which he says tramples all over due process. To him, it's not a safety measure. It's the first step on a slippery slope to a national gun registry, which he believes is just a precursor to confiscation. So once he's tried to tear down the other side's arguments, the author starts building up his own case. And he builds it on what he presents as 2 absolutely non-negotiable foundational rights. You can think of these as the pillars holding up his entire worldview. And really, his entire philosophy boils down to these 2 ideas. First, you've got the right to life. He says this is the big one, the most basic right there is. And from there, he says it's simple. You have a right to the tools you need to preserve that life, including any firearm. The second pillar is the right to resist tyranny. And this is key. It elevates gun ownership from just personal self-defense to being a fundamental check on government power itself. And to back up this pretty radical idea of resisting tyranny, he pulls out quotes from the Founding Fathers, especially Patrick Henry. He uses this quote to frame the Second Amendment not just as a right for self-defense, but as a necessary tool for, quote, waging war against tyrants. This really frames armed rebellion as a legitimate, even intended purpose of the amendment. All right, so from philosophy, the book pivots to history. The author presents a few key events as basically cautionary tales, historical I told you so moments that he believes justify a heavily armed populace. And you can see he builds a very specific narrative here. He draws a direct line from the Bonus Army March, where thousands of armed World War I vets marched on Washington, to the 1934 National Firearms Act, claiming the government got scared and passed the law in response. Then he fast-forwards to the 90s, reframing the tragic events at Ruby Ridge and Waco not as standoffs, but as government massacres to enforce what he considers unconstitutional laws. And that brings us to, without a doubt, the most explosive and controversial claim in the whole book. The author alleges that the U.S. Gun Control Act of 1968 wasn't some original piece of American legislation. No, he claims it was essentially copied and pasted directly from Nazi Germany's 1938 weapons law. So, how does he try to prove this? Well, he puts the two laws side by side. He points out what he says are nearly identical requirements for things like dealer record books, permits for buyers, the minimum age to buy a rifle, and even the exact same exemptions for antique firearms. And in his mind, you look at this and there's just no way it's a coincidence. And this right here, this is what the author presents as the smoking gun. It's a copy of a 1968 letter from the Library of Congress to Senator Thomas Dodd, who was a driving force behind the U.S. Gun Control Act. The letter confirms that the senator's office had asked for and received a translation of that 1938 Nazi law just months before the American law was passed. To the author, that's it. Case closed. That's the proof. Okay, so with his legal claim, his philosophy, and his historical warnings all on the table, the author makes his final play, a full-on attempt to completely reframe the entire gun control debate as we know it. He uses statistics like these to make a pretty bold point that our public focus on gun deaths is, well, a distraction. He shows that the number of people who die from things like medical errors or obesity is astronomically higher, and suggests that if saving lives was really the goal, that's where our political energy would be. It's his way of trying to pivot the conversation away from public safety. And all of this funnels down into his final, ultimate point. For him, all the talk about crime rates and saving lives completely misses what's really going on. He argues that the real issue, the unspoken one, isn't safety, it's power. The entire debate, in his view, is just a tug-of-war between the power of the citizen and the power of the state. So that leaves us with the book's final challenge to the reader. By completely reframing the issue, moving it away from a question of public safety versus gun rights and turning it into a question of individual liberty versus government tyranny, how does that change how we look at everything? It's a really provocative way to frame it, and it's clearly designed to make you stop and rethink the entire conversation from the ground up.